Nicholas Lee Ingram was pronounced dead at 9:15 p.m. Friday, April the 7th, 1995.
What goes through a man's mind when he knows he's about to die, and the entire world knows it too? Does he feel fear, regret, or a strange kind of peace? On the night of April 7th, 1995, a man named Nicholas Lee Ingram was strapped into Georgia's electric chair. The room was silent. His head had been shaved, his arms and legs bound, and moments later, with a single burst of voltage, his life ended. But the controversy had only just begun. Some called him cold, others said he had changed, and in his final hours, Nicholas Ingram showed no fear, only defiance. A last cigarette, a few quiet goodbyes, then silence. What really happened during those last 24 hours? This is the story of Nicholas Lee Ingram's final day on Earth. Nicholas Lee Ingram was born in England in 1963, but he spent most of his life in the United States. His family moved across the Atlantic when he was still a young boy. Like many kids growing up in the South, he struggled to find a place in the world, caught somewhere between two cultures and eventually between two very different systems of justice. As a teenager and young adult, Nicholas drifted. He had brushes with the law. He spent time in and out of trouble. But no one could have imagined that one day he'd become the center of an international death penalty debate, one that would pull in the governments of two countries and capture headlines across the globe. The crime that sealed Nicholas Ingram's fate began on the evening of June 3, 1983. But its roots started earlier that day. Ingram was just 19 years old, drifting through life without much direction. That afternoon, he visited a pawn shop with a friend, where he sold some car wheels and a ring. The money from those items wouldn't last long. Later that day, he and his friend returned to his father's house, where they picked up a .38 caliber revolver. Ingram told his friend that he needed a vehicle, something he could use to head out to California. They drove toward Marietta, Georgia, to an area Ingram seemed to know well. As the sun began to set, he told his friend to wait in the car. Before getting out, he said something that now sounds chilling. He planned to pistol whip the people inside, but wasn't sure if he'd be able to go through with killing them. His friend, disturbed by what he heard, made a decision. He didn't wait. He drove away, leaving Ingram alone. What happened next was brutal. At around 6:30 p.m., Ingram knocked on the door of an elderly couple, J.C. and Mary Sawyer, who lived in a quiet Cobb County neighborhood. At first, he asked to use their phone, but the request quickly turned into a threat. Ingram pulled out the revolver and demanded money and car keys, saying he would shoot if they didn't cooperate. Mary Sawyer handed him $60. J.C. Sawyer gave up the keys to their pickup truck, but it didn't end there. Ingram forced the couple out of their home and into the woods nearby. He tied their hands behind their backs using rope and wire. Then he bound them both to a tree. The couple begged for their lives. Ingram taunted them, threatened them, then tore his own shirt in half and stuffed the cloth into their mouths as gags. Without warning, he raised the revolver and shot them both in the head at close range. J.C. Sawyer died instantly. Somehow, Mary survived. She lay still, pretending to be dead, listening as Ingram started her husband's truck and drove away. When the coast was clear, she untied herself, checked her husband's body, and ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. That same night, people spotted Ingram at a convenience store, still driving the stolen pickup truck. 3 days later, the truck was found abandoned on the side of a highway in Mississippi. Inside, investigators found a receipt from a motel in Alabama, dated June 3rd. The motel's copy of the receipt had Ingram's handwriting on it. He had vanished. Somehow, Ingram made it all the way to California, where he stole another car. From there, he headed to Nebraska, where he was finally arrested for driving under the influence. At first, the police were just curious about the stolen car. But when they started asking questions, Ingram shocked them. He admitted he was wanted for murder in Georgia. He was extradited back to Georgia and gave a partial confession. He said he remembered being dropped off at the Sawyer home. He remembered waking up in a parking lot in Alabama the next day. But he claimed he was too drunk to remember anything else. No murder, no robbery. By then, the evidence was strong, and the damage was already done. Just days later, Ingram was arrested in Tennessee. The trial moved quickly. Prosecutors presented the surviving victim's account. A jury found him guilty of murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. And then came the sentence. Ingram was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by electric chair for killing J.C. Sawyer, a 55-year-old retired military veteran. But the story didn't end with the conviction. Years later, Ingram's new lawyers discovered something disturbing. They claimed that during his 1983 trial, Ingram had been heavily medicated, given antipsychotic drugs by prison officials that made him appear emotionless and unremorseful. This flat, emotionless behavior may have played a crucial role in the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. They never saw a young man begging for forgiveness. They saw someone cold, someone silent. His new legal team argued that he was too drugged to understand his own trial, and that he couldn't help his defense team as a result. Even worse, they said his trial attorney had never been informed that Nicholas had a psychiatric diagnosis. Information that, if known, could have changed the strategy of the defense entirely. The appeal made it all the way to U.S. District Court, where Judge Horace Ward reviewed the claims. But he ultimately dismissed the plea, ruling that these concerns had already been addressed in prior appeals. The courts would not give Ingram another chance. As the execution date drew closer, the fight to save Nicholas Ingram shifted from courtrooms to global headlines. His case was taken up by the British media, and soon an international wave of appeals began pouring in. His mother, Anne Ingram, traveled tirelessly, pleading with lawmakers, churches, and world leaders to save her son. She helped gather letters from 53 members of the UK Parliament, the Archbishop of Canterbury, human rights groups, and even the President of the European Parliament. One of her most desperate appeals went to UK Prime Minister John Major, who was visiting Washington at the time. She handed him a letter in person, and he responded, handwritten and respectful, but clear. "I found your letter very moving, but I have concluded with deepest regret that there are no proper grounds for the British government to intervene with the state of Georgia." The answer was no. Georgia Governor Zell Miller also refused to halt the execution, even in the face of overwhelming international pressure. Ingram's legal team ran out of time, and so did he. The countdown had begun, and nothing would stop what came next. The morning of April 6, 1995, began with quiet tension inside Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. This was supposed to be the day Nicholas Ingram died in the electric chair. But just 1 hour before his scheduled execution, a sudden phone call changed everything. A federal judge issued a temporary stay of execution, granting Ingram a 24-hour reprieve. This is where Nicholas Ingram's final 24 hours begin. The final morning of Nicholas Lee Ingram's life began just like the one before it, with silence. But this time, there would be no last-minute call. No delay. Nicholas Lee Ingram woke up in his death row cell at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Center. The room was quiet, sterile, and cold, the reality of the day ahead settling heavily on his mind. His thoughts raced, memories of the decades-long legal battle, the victims, the family, and the life he had led all swirling in his mind. The usual prison sounds, distant footsteps, the faint clatter of metal doors only reminded him that the clock was ticking. Shortly after waking, guards arrived with his early breakfast. Ingram's meal was simple and unremarkable: toast, scrambled eggs, maybe a small portion of fruit or oatmeal. The food was nourishment, but in that moment, it tasted like ash. The routine of eating was more an act of habit than desire. The breakfast tray sat in front of him, But his appetite was subdued, overshadowed by the anxiety and dread tightening in his gut. The prison's sterile environment offered no comfort, just the cold reality that this was likely the last morning meal he would ever have. Ingram sat quietly, staring ahead, perhaps lost in thought or wrestling with memories. The clock's ticking became a relentless reminder of time slipping away. Guards passed by, their faces unreadable, doing their duty with clinical detachment. For Ingram, the world had shrunk to the four walls of his cell, the cold metal bars, and the final hours ticking relentlessly onward. Though the prison's routines tried to mimic normalcy, there was nothing ordinary about this morning. The gravity of his situation settled deep inside him, quiet but unyielding. Ingram's cell was silent. No visitors were allowed this early, only the cold routine of guards checking in. Inside, he was left alone with his thoughts and the weight of what was to come. Some witnesses who knew him described him as sullen and withdrawn during these final hours. The bravado of a lifetime gave way to something more human: fear, regret, maybe even anger. It was a moment where past and present collided, a final reckoning before the irreversible end. The prison staff continued their preparations for the evening's execution. Ingram's belongings would be gathered, final checks of the electric chair conducted. Meanwhile, Ingram remained in his cell, the minutes ticking by slowly, each one dragging the day closer to its grim conclusion. As the sun moved overhead on April 7th, the prison around Nicholas Ingram began to prepare for the inevitable. Outside the gates, the crowd of reporters and protesters grew larger. Some were calling for justice. Others held candles and signs, begging for mercy. Inside, Nicholas sat behind thick steel and concrete, well aware of the hourglass that was now emptying by the minute. Around early afternoon, a final decision came down. His appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court had officially been denied. This time, there would be no reprieve. There were no more avenues to explore, no more paperwork to file. The legal fight was over. As he was informed of the ruling, Ingram's calm demeanor held. There was no visible reaction, no shouting, no anger. He simply nodded. Some observers noted that his earlier confidence, seen during the temporary stay the day before, had faded into a quiet, steady stillness. Whether that was resignation or peace, only he truly knew. In those quiet afternoon hours, Nicholas was granted one final visit with his parents. His mother, Anne, had fought relentlessly for his life. She had written to leaders across the world, including the British Prime Minister, and stood outside courthouse doors, hoping for a change. Now she stood in front of her son for the very last time. He wore a baseball cap during the visit. His head had already been shaved for the electric chair. He didn't want his mother to see that. They spoke through a glass barrier, connected only by a telephone. It was quiet, emotional, and short. No one has publicly revealed all that was said between them, but after the meeting, Anne described her son as peaceful, strong, and clear-headed. She held it together as long as she could, but when the time came to leave, she broke down. Nicholas, however, stayed composed, watching her walk away with a long, steady gaze. It was the last time he would ever see his mother, the last hug denied by thick prison glass. As the afternoon wore on, Nicholas was left alone again in his cell. He refused any spiritual counsel. He didn't request a Bible reading or a chaplain's prayer. He didn't write a final statement. As the evening crept in, the halls inside Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison remained hushed and clinical. Nicholas Lee Ingram was just hours away from being executed by electric chair, and the state was making final preparations. His posture, according to witnesses, was still calm, quiet, even defiant. He didn't ask for a sedative, and when offered the traditional last meal, he refused it entirely. He reportedly said, "I don't want a last meal. You're about to kill me." There was only one request he made, a last cigarette, but even that at first was denied. Prison officials claimed it was against health regulations to allow smoking inside the prison. That decision, absurd in context, triggered an emotional response from Clive Stafford Smith, Ingram's human rights lawyer. In an interview, he recalled his disbelief. "You know they go through all that nonsense about last meals, and Nicky said, 'I don't want a last meal because you're about to kill me.' And he said, 'I want a last cigarette.' So I ask if they'll give him a last cigarette, and they say no because it's bad for his health." Clive was furious. "I say, you've got to be kidding me. You're planning to kill this poor guy." So I went out and told the media, and they were humiliated by that, so they gave him a last cigarette. But then they shaved his head and shaved his leg, and put 2,400 volts through him. It's just disgusting. After public pressure mounted, the prison reversed its decision and allowed Ingram his cigarette. He smoked it in solitude, without comment, without ceremony. Meanwhile, inside the execution chamber, officials checked and rechecked the equipment. The electric chair rarely used had been thoroughly inspected. The sponge, the restraints, the leather straps, the electrodes, all were prepared with clinical precision. This was process, not compassion. Nicholas remained quiet in his final hours. Outside, the world waited. Inside, the executioner prepared to flip the switch. At exactly 9 o'clock on the night of April 7, 1995, prison officials at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison began the final walk. Down a sterile corridor, under bright lights and heavy silence, Nicholas Lee Ingram stepped forward alone. He had refused assistance, choosing to walk himself to the chair. It was the last act of defiance from a man who had spent over a decade fighting his sentence. He entered the execution chamber at a steady pace, surrounded by prison staff and a small group of official witnesses. He glared coldly at them, each face one by one. The guards, the prison officials, even his own attorney. When he was asked whether he wished to have a final prayer, some sources suggested Ingram replied, "Let's get on with it." Other sources stated Ingram simply closed his eyes and did not mention Ingram speaking. The guards helped him into Old Sparky, the nickname for Georgia's electric chair. His wrists, ankles, and chest were strapped tightly to the thick wooden frame. His head had been shaved earlier that day to ensure full electrical contact. A metal cap was fixed to his scalp, and a brown leather mask was pulled over his face. His knuckles turned white, gripping the arms of the chair with tense pressure. At 9:06 p.m., the executioner pressed the button. 2,000 volts surged into Ingram's body. His body jerked back violently in the chair. Then the voltage dropped first to 1,000 volts, then again to 208 volts. There was no smoke, no sparks, no noise, just a quiet jolt, followed by stillness. A witness later said, "He shot back in the chair with a tremendous jolt, but there was no sign of movement, nothing." After 12 long years on death row, Nicholas Ingram was still. At 9:15 p.m., the prison doctor pronounced him dead. Crowds stood behind barricades, lit by candlelight and surrounded by reporters. Some prayed, some wept, others remained silent. Even the death penalty supporters who had gathered fell quiet when the announcement came. "The order of the court has been carried out," said spokeswoman Vicky Gavalis. Nicholas Lee Ingram was pronounced dead at 9:15 p.m. His attorney, Clive Stafford Smith, later spoke through tears. "Nicky wasn't very good at speaking," he said quietly. "He asked me to say he wasn't the one getting hurt, but his family and the family of the Sawyers. He said he hoped for something better now, because what had happened in this life had been so sad." The story of Nicholas Ingram didn't fade quickly. His execution stirred deep ethical and legal questions, especially because of his dual citizenship, the international outcry, and the way his final hours played out. Some remember him as a cold-blooded killer. Others see a troubled young man whose life unraveled into violence and whose final years showed signs of regret, if not redemption. His ashes were not buried in Georgia, and no public service was held in his memory. But the arguments surrounding his case about capital punishment, justice, and mercy continued long after the chair was turned off. As the news faded from front pages, one question remained. Was this justice served, or a life taken that could never be restored? Let us know what you think in the comments and subscribe for more stories that take you inside the final moments that history never forgets. History never forgets.